There is a hollow in the Sipsey wilderness, where the sandstone bluffs close in on both sides, and the eastern hemlocks grow so thick along the creek floor that the light of a clear November noon never reaches the ground. The bluff walls rise 40 feet from the water on each side, and where the north wall curves inward under its own weight at the cap, the overhang creates a corridor at the base that stays dry in any rain and cold in any season. A hunter followed a blood trail into that hollow in the second week of gun season in November of 2018. He had made a shot from his stand at last light, watched the deer flinch and move south, waited 30 minutes, and then followed the trail into the drainage as the afternoon faded toward dark. He expected to find a deer at the end of the trail. What was braced against that bluff face when his headlamp found it, bleeding from a wound along its left flank, watching him with amber eyes from 7 feet of standing height, was a dogman. It did not attack him. What it did instead is the reason he agreed to tell this story, and what it was warning him about is the part that has no comfortable resting place. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. The man who provided this account asked that we change his name. We will call him Lonnie. That is not what the people in Winston County, Alabama, call him. He was specific about why the change mattered. He spent over 25 years working for a road maintenance contractor that held county contracts in Winston and Lawrence and Walker counties in North Alabama, and the professional network that work built is the network he still lives and moves inside. He is known in that county as a man with sound judgment and a clear head. He intends to keep it that way. He was equally specific about what we were permitted to keep accurate. The county is real, the forest is real, the hollow is real, and the bluff and the creek that runs beside it, and the quality of the light in that hollow in November. Only the name is changed. That was the only thing he asked. Winston County sits in the northwest quadrant of Alabama's hill country, south of the Tennessee River Valley, and east of the flat agricultural plain of the Mississippi embayment. The county seat is Double Springs, a small community of around 1,000 people in a county of about 24,000, spread across 812 square miles of mixed farmland, timber company holdings, and national forest. The landscape is sandstone ridgelines, running northeast to southwest, with creek drainages cutting between them, and in the western portions of the county, the terrain sharpens into something more dramatic. The southern end of the Cumberland Plateau reaches down into Alabama here, and becomes the geology that created the Sipsey Fork gorge system. The sandstone bluffs in the Bankhead country to the west of Double Springs are not the rolling hills that most people picture when they picture North Alabama. They are steep canyon walls with overhanging ledges and tight creek slots, and hemlock stands growing in conditions that should not exist at this latitude. It is serious country, the kind of country that does not forgive carelessness in any season. Lonnie grew up in Winston County in a family that had been in those hills for generations. His grandfather had worked timber in the area during the decades before the Second World War, when the mature stands of chestnut and white oak were still coming down across private land that would eventually be absorbed into the national forest. His father farmed 20 acres of creek bottomland on the family property and hunted the surrounding forest every fall without exception. By the time Lonnie was old enough to carry a rifle safely, he had already been following his father and his 2 older brothers through those ridgelines and hollows for years. The country was not abstract to him. It was the ground underneath his feet from the time he could walk. The same ground his grandfather had worked and his father had hunted, and he learned it the way a person learns something they intend to live inside for the rest of their life. Not from a map, from walking it in every season and every condition that North Alabama produces, which across a lifetime is enough to know a piece of ground the way most people never know anywhere. For over 25 years, Lonnie worked road maintenance in the hill country of North Alabama, county road work, grading and maintaining the network of unpaved roads that connected the small communities through the hill country of Winston and Lawrence and Walker counties, keeping drainage ditches clear, managing gravel on dirt surfaces, running equipment in rain and heat, and the hard winter cold of a North Alabama January that does not feel like much until it has been inside your clothes for 8 hours. The work kept him outdoors through most of the year and gave him access to corners of those counties that the people who lived in the towns never had occasion to drive through. He knew every county road in Winston County, paved in gravel and dirt. He knew which creek crossings held after a heavy rain and which ones washed out on the second pass. He knew which sections of the rural road network had been improved in the past decade and which sections had not had attention since before he started the job. He knew the Forest Service roads that connected the county system to the interior of the Bankhead and had driven most of them enough times to know which ones stayed passable in wet November weather and which ones became problems in ways that required specific solutions.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
He had also hunted the Bankhead for most of those years, not every season without interruption. There were stretches when work ran heavy and the timing did not line up. There were years when his children were young, and Arlene was managing the household on her own during long contract stretches. And taking extended time in the field was not something the family budget could absorb in terms of lost days or attention. But most years he was in the woods during gun season, and many years during archery season as well. His hunting ground for the 15 years before the encounter had been the upper Sipsey Fork drainage, in the section of the wilderness area that runs along the county line between Lawrence and Winston south of the Sipsey River Road. He had come to that ground through a recommendation from a man he had worked alongside for most of a decade, who told him the deer density in those hollow systems was unlike anything else he had found in the Bankhead. He checked the recommendation and found it accurate, and had kept coming back season after season, gradually learning the upper drainage as he had learned the rest of the hill country, by walking it until it became familiar, as only ground you have crossed in every season and in every kind of weather can become familiar. The William B. Bankhead National Forest covers roughly 180,000 acres across Lawrence, Winston, Walker, and Cullman counties. It was established in 1918 and named for Alabama Senator John Hollis Bankhead, a proponent of early federal land conservation in the South. The forest was assembled primarily from cutover land that timber companies had stripped in the decades before the First World War, and from marginal agricultural land that had never fully recovered from 19th century cotton farming. The Civilian Conservation Corps came through in the 1930s and built much of the road and recreational infrastructure that still defines the forest's accessible geography. They planted pine plantations on the stripped ridgelines and built impoundments on the major creek drainages and constructed the fire towers that stood on the high points until satellite technology made them unnecessary. What the CCC did not reach, and what recovered on its own in the deeper hollows of the gorge country because the terrain made efficient logging impractical, is the most significant old forest left in the Bankhead. The eastern hemlock stands in the deep canyon bottoms of the Sipsey Fork drainage are unusual for their latitude. Hemlocks are typically associated with cool, moist conditions considerably further north and east than North Alabama, but the microclimate created by the sandstone gorges replicates those conditions well enough that individual hemlocks in the deepest hollows have reached sizes that wildlife biologists who work the Bankhead mention with the tone of someone, quoting a number they still find surprising. Some of the hemlocks along the shaded creek banks of the inner Sipsey are of a size that suggests establishment well before the CCC arrived, and in some cases well before the systematic logging era. They grow in narrow corridors where direct sunlight reaches the ground for only a few hours per day, even at midsummer, where the soil stays moist from the creek alongside, where the temperature differential between the hollow floor and the ridgeline 20 minutes above can exceed 20 degrees on a July afternoon, and in November approaches something closer to a different climate zone entirely. The Sipsey Wilderness portion of the Bankhead was designated by the Eastern Wilderness Act in 1975, the first wilderness area created specifically in recognition of second-growth eastern forest as deserving federal wilderness protection. It covers approximately 25,000 acres in the gorge and bluff country of the Sipsey Fork and its tributaries. The Sipsey Fork itself was designated a wild and scenic river in 1988, the first river in Alabama to receive that designation, and the corridor extends from the wilderness boundary downstream through the gorge country toward the confluence of the Sipsey Fork with the Mulberry Fork of the Black Warrior River. Inside the wilderness boundary, Nothing with an engine is permitted. No chainsaws, no ATVs, no motorized equipment of any kind. The Forest Service roads stop at the boundary. If you are going in, you are going on foot, and the terrain is going to make clear immediately that it means this. The bluffs drop without warning in the narrow slot canyons of the interior gorge system. The creek crossings that are ankle-deep in summer are thigh-deep after a significant rain. Cell service that is marginal at the Forest Service roads is non-existent in the wilderness interior. The distances on the topographic map are what they say, plus the additional distance that vertical terrain always adds to a flat calculation. Lonnie had been hunting in this country long enough to know exactly what it could do to a careless person, and what preparations made the difference between a difficult day and a genuinely dangerous one. He carried a headlamp on every entry after noon. He carried a radio that connected to a repeater several miles to the north that could push a signal out to cell range in an emergency. A piece of equipment he had purchased after a knee injury some years earlier left him walking out of the wilderness in the dark, and clarified for him that the radio he had been meaning to buy was not optional. He knew the terrain of the upper Sipsey Fork drainage with the precision of someone who has crossed it in every season, in fog and rain, and the 3 or 4 days a year that North Alabama gets actual snow on the ground, in the first light dark of October archery season, and the bitter cold of the January muzzleloader season. He knew the country. He knew it well enough to be surprised by what it still held. The defining feature of the Sipsey wilderness is the bluff system, Pottsville sandstone, laid down during the Pennsylvanian period when North Alabama was covered by a shallow inland sea, 320 million years behind every surface in those gorges. The same rock sequence that runs through the Black Warrior Coal Basin in Walker and Jefferson counties becomes the canyon walls of the Sipsey Fork Gorge in Lawrence and Winston. The bluffs rise from the creek bottoms at angles that range from steep slopes to vertical faces, capped by overhanging ledges where the softer material beneath has eroded away faster than the harder cap rock above. These overhangs, which the people who live near the Bankhead call rock houses, are the defining visual feature of the Sipsey. They can run for hundreds of yards along a single bluff face, creating sheltered corridors at the base of the cliff, where the overhang keeps the ground dry through any rain, where the temperature stays cooler in summer and warmer in winter than the exposed ground above, where the depth of the shelter ranges from a few feet to spaces where a person can stand fully upright without touching the rock above. The moss that grows on the inside face of the overhang stays green through November and into December, while everything above has gone brown. In the tight hollows where the bluff walls close in on both sides, the rock houses provide the only substantial dry ground on the hollow floor. Archaeologists have documented human occupation of these rock houses spanning thousands of years. The woodland period cultures used them for shelter and storage. The Mississippian period cultures that followed used some sites for burial. The Cherokee people, whose territory in North Alabama extended through the Tennessee River Valley and south into the hill country of what are now Lawrence and Winston and Cullman counties, used the rock houses as the woodland people had used them before. The physical shelter they provided was too practical to ignore across any period of human occupation in the region. The Cherokee people knew this country with a depth of understanding that the European settlement that displaced them never developed and never sought to develop. Their traditional territory included the North Alabama highlands. Their settlements along the Tennessee River Valley extended south into the hill country. The area that is now the Bankhead National Forest was Cherokee hunting ground for generations before European contact changed the terms on which that land was occupied, and the Cherokee understanding of what inhabited the deep forest of the Sipsey country was not limited to the species that appear in any contemporary wildlife management database. James Mooney, the ethnographer who spent years in direct contact with Cherokee communities in the late 19th century, and produced the foundational documentation of Cherokee oral traditions in his work on Cherokee myths, published in the 1890s, recorded the Cherokee understanding of the deep forest as occupied territory in ways that went beyond what Western natural history had any framework for. Specific drainages and hollows were recognized as the claimed spaces of beings that had been on the land before the Cherokee, and that operated by rules the Cherokee had learned to work around. The appropriate response to those territories was not confrontation and not reverence in the ceremonial sense. It was recognition A hunter who needed to pass through territory that was claimed by one of these beings did so efficiently and without lingering. Game was not pursued into certain hollows, regardless of how clear the sign was. This was not superstition, as outsiders interpreted it. It was the practical management of a landscape that contained actors whose behavior the Cherokee had mapped carefully enough to know which situations to avoid. The removal of the Cherokee from North Alabama between 1835 and 1839 killed thousands. Of the 17,000 people displaced and erased from the landscape everything they had learned about it over generations, the specific knowledge about which hollows were not for humans to enter, and on what terms the deep forest was shared with beings that had been there before the Cherokee went with them into exile in Indian Territory. What moved into the North Alabama highlands in their place was a settler culture that had no framework for that knowledge and no inclination to request it, even if it had been offered. 180 years later, a retired county road contractor sat in his truck in the dark beside Forest Service Road 60 and tried to understand what had happened to him in a language that his culture had never developed to describe it. The second day of gun season, in November of 2018, was a Thursday. Lonnie had taken Thursday through Sunday off from work, which was his standard practice during rut week, the period in mid-November when the peak of the white-tailed deer breeding season aligns with the opening of Alabama's gun season and produces the hunting conditions that serious deer hunters in the southeast structure their entire fall around. His hunting partner for most of his adult life was a man we will call Dewey, who had grown up in the next county and had hunted the Bankhead with Lonnie for close to 30 years. Dewey could not make Thursday, a family matter he had not been able to defer. Lonnie went alone. He had a stand position he had been wanting to sit all season, on a bench above a drainage that fed into Thompson Creek, a location that had produced good bucks in prior seasons when the conditions aligned. He was not going to sit at home on a rut week Thursday because Dewey had a scheduling conflict. He parked at the pull-off on Forest Service Road 60 before 5 in the morning and hiked in with his headlamp. The morning was cold, upper 20s at departure, forecast to stay cold through mid-morning before climbing into the low 40s by afternoon. He wore his heaviest hunting clothes and put hand warmers in the outer pockets of his bibs. The walk to his stand was 1.25 miles on the Forest Service trail along the ridgeline before dropping to the bench. He was on stand well before legal shooting light. The morning went slowly. The thermals ran down the hollow in the cold air, which complicated his scent situation for anything moving uphill toward the ridge. He shifted his position on the stand twice to minimize the exposure. A doe crossed the ridgeline above him at mid-morning, too far and moving wrong. A gray squirrel worked the beech mast directly below for 20 minutes and then vanished into the leaf litter. By noon he had climbed down, eaten his lunch on a stump, and was doing the calculation that every serious deer hunter runs at some point during every long, cold, slow morning. He had found fresh scrapes on the ridgeline 2 days earlier. The deep oval scrapes that a serious buck works repeatedly during the rut. Edges turned bright and the overhanging branches above stripped and twisted. The afternoon was a chance to check those scrapes again and explore the lower benches of the hollow for stand locations he had not yet evaluated. He pushed into the hollow. He explained this decision carefully when he discussed it. He was not an impulsive person in that country. He had been going into the Sipsey drainage long enough to know what impulsiveness could cost. He pushed into the hollow because he was prepared, because he knew the terrain, because he had told Arlene he might be late, and because the rut week pressure that builds in any serious deer hunter over the course of a slow morning builds to the point where sitting at the truck through a clear November afternoon feels like losing something you cannot get back. He went in with his headlamp and his rifle and his radio and 30 years of knowledge of that specific drainage. The encounter that followed was not the result of carelessness. The first thing he noticed when he dropped below the ridgeline into the upper section of the hollow was the quiet. Not the quiet of a cold morning before the forest wakes up. A different quality of quiet. An absence of the small movements that a functioning forest makes throughout the day. No squirrels working the beech ridge above. No Carolina wrens in the log piles along the bluff base, which normally called at intervals all through the colder months. No sound of the creek he could hear from this section of the hollow on most visits. The hemlock canopy above the creek bottom was completely still, with a stillness that was not wind stillness. He had been in those woods hundreds of times. He knew what they sounded like when they were occupied. He noted the difference and kept moving. The creak sound that he normally picked up at this point in the descent was also gone. The Sipsey Fork drainage ran audible in November, not loud, but present. A low, consistent sound that oriented you in the narrow canyon the way a compass orients you on open ground. He registered its absence before he registered anything else, and the absence was the thing that changed the quality of the walk, from familiar to something his body was processing, with more attention than the terrain alone required. He found the blood 3/4 of a mile into the hollow, at the edge of a flat limestone outcropping where the creek bent back into its channel and the terrain opened out momentarily before closing in again. The blood was old at first, dark, dried on the pale limestone, spattered in a pattern that read immediately as a running animal. He crouched and looked at the pattern, long spacing between the droplets, a scared animal covering ground rather than a wounded animal slowing. He read it as a deer hit from a hunter somewhere on the far side of the ridgeline, an animal that had run through the night and come to ground in the hollow. He started following it. For the first 200 yards, the blood trail stayed consistent with what he had read it as. Dark, intermittent, dried on the leaf litter between the beeches and tulip poplars. He followed it through a flat section along the creek and into the tight narrows, where the bluffs began closing in from both sides, and the hemlock canopy started blocking what light the afternoon had left. His headlamp came on. He kept tracking. At a boulder the size of a washing machine, he stopped. The blood on the boulder was wrong. The color was wrong. Not the dark red of deer blood he had been following, but darker, thicker. The volume of it, dried in a long smear across the flat upper surface, suggested a being with considerably more mass than a white-tailed deer. He looked at the smear more carefully under the headlamp and found, in the center of it, an impression. He looked at this impression for a long time. 5 digits, a thumb set wide and low on the outside of the palm, fingers long and tapering, with narrow claw-tip marks at the end of each one. Not a bear's front paw. A bear's front paw produces a broad, rounded impression with an asymmetrical toe arrangement, the inner toe distinctly smaller than the others. This was different in the spacing and in the shape and in the opposition of the thumb. He stared at it under the headlamp for what felt like a full minute. His brain ran through every familiar shape it had and came back empty. He stood up and looked ahead. The hollow narrowed to about 15 feet at that point, with the creek along the left side and the sandstone bluff rising on the right to the overhang 40 feet above. The base of the bluff, where the overhang began, was perhaps 20 yards ahead of him. From the shadow under the overhang, from that shadow specifically, amber light came back at him. 2 points of reflected headlamp, eyes set at the height of his collarbone or above and too far apart. He stopped. He could hear it breathing before his mind had fully assembled the rest of the visual. The sound reached him a fraction before everything else did. A slow, deep rhythm in the cold air of the hollow, controlled and measured, carrying something that was neither distress nor calm, but something in between that he could not name. He stood still. The amber eyes looked at him. Neither of them moved. Over the following seconds, which he describes as taking considerably longer than seconds, the headlamp beam assembled the rest of the picture. A body upright against the bluff face, 7 feet tall or close to it, broad through the chest and shoulders, filling much of the space under the overhang. Dark fur, almost black, matted from the hip down the left leg where the blood had soaked through and dried. The wound was along the left flank, a tear from the hip joint up toward the lower ribs, 6 to 8 inches of open tissue visible even in the cone of the headlamp, the exposed underlying flesh dark from the hours that had passed since the injury. The dogman had been there for a long time, long enough for the blood to pool and begin to congeal in the packed earth beneath it. The head was wrong. He knew this without having a comparison to apply to it. He knew it as a person knows when a mechanical system is producing the wrong sound, through accumulated familiarity with what cracked looks like. The skull was long. The muzzle extended 4 or 5 inches forward from the eye line, not in the blunt profile of a bear's skull, but in the way a canine skull is oriented, with the nose at the end of the muzzle and the eyes well back from the front of the face. The ears stood upright, pointed, set high on the skull. The jaw was slightly open. He did not raise his rifle. He said later that his hands never moved toward it. He said its posture communicated something that functioned in him like a directive before he could process it rationally. The posture was not threatening and not submissive, more complex than either, something that worked on him at a level below conscious thinking and produced the result of a direct instruction. Leave the rifle where it is. He stood with his hands at his sides and the headlamp on it, and his heart beating in a way he could hear clearly, which is what happens to the human cardiovascular system when the body understands it is standing close to something at the top of the food chain. His hearing had sharpened. He could hear the water moving in the creek 10 feet to his left. He could hear the drip of moisture from the overhang above. He could hear his own breathing, and its breathing, that slow, controlled rhythm that was the first thing he had registered, still moving at the same rate, unchanged by his presence. For what he estimates at 2 minutes, possibly slightly less, neither of them moved. Then, its eyes shifted, not to the ground or to the sides. They moved upward and to the left, toward the rim of the bluff 40 feet above. The head turned slightly in the same direction, and then it vocalized, low, below the register of anything he associated with living things he had spent his life beside. It had tonal components and structured components, a pattern of variation that repeated twice, and then changed on the third iteration in a way he cannot precisely describe, because he does not have a language for the tonal structure of sounds he had never heard before. He felt the low-frequency component in his chest before his ears processed it as organized sound. His sternum vibrated with it. The first 2 repetitions of the pattern were identical. The third was different. Its eyes came back to him. They held his for a moment. Then they moved to the bluff rim above, then back to him. The sequence repeated, rim, him, rim, him, 4 times in the space of 30 or 40 seconds, in a pattern specific enough that his mind, working through the disorientation of everything else happening simultaneously, eventually landed on the only interpretation that fit. The Dogman was not reacting to him and separately reacting to the rim. It was directing his attention between the two. There was something above them on the bluff. It was telling him. He took a step back. The amber eyes came to him immediately. Held. He took another step, and then turned and moved through the hollow the way he had come in. Not running. Running on the boulder-strewn, hemlock-rooted floor of the hollow in the dark would have been a broken leg waiting to happen. He moved fast, placing each foot with care, covering ground as quickly as the terrain allowed. When he reached the flat limestone shelf, he increased his pace. When the hollow widened, he went to a jog on the more open ground, 50 yards past the bend in the creek. The bluff wall on the right side of the hollow stepped down to about 20 feet. There was a sandstone face he had climbed before on scouting trips, a route with natural ledges and handholds worn into the rock by water, negotiable if you knew where to put your hands and feet. He had been up it in daylight with a day pack. He went up it now in the dark with the headlamp off, working from memory and from touch. His rifle across his back, his hands on the sandstone, which was cold and slightly damp, with the perpetual moisture of the hollow and rough in the way of old concrete. He did not fall. He moved carefully, and he did not fall, and he reached the top and crawled back from the edge into the thick timber of the ridgeline and got himself behind a white oak, 40 feet from the rim, and shut his headlamp off completely. He waited. The cold worked through his hunting clothes immediately. He was not moving enough to generate heat, and the temperature was in the upper 20s, and the wind moved across the ridgeline with a low, steady pressure that compounded the cold in the way that wind in the open woods always does. He ignored the cold. He listened. He heard them before he saw them. The sound of something heavy moving through dry November leaf litter carries at distance in cold air, and what he heard coming from his right, from further north along the ridgeline, was multiple sources of that sound. Heavy, purposeful, moving toward the bluff edge above the hollow. He tried to count the sources and came up with 3, though he acknowledged later that one of them was moving more quietly than the others, and he might have been underestimating. The movement converged toward the rim of the bluff above the overhang, where the wounded one had been braced. They stopped at the edge. He could see shapes against the sky. The western ridgeline still held the last pale orange of the November sunset behind the bare tree line, and the shapes at the bluff edge were silhouetted against it. 3 of them, upright, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way he recognized from 40 feet below in the hollow. The head profiles showed in silhouette, elongated muzzles, ears upright and pointed, set high on the skull. The largest of the three stood at the rim and called down. The sound carried in the cold air of the slot canyon below him. Low, structured, different in quality from what the wounded one had produced, but recognizably related to it. The same instrument, different content. From below, the response came back, shorter, subdued, the quality of communication from something in pain rather than something at full capacity. The three at the rim moved south along the ridgeline for perhaps 40 yards to where the bluff height stepped down to a more manageable grade. And then they went over the edge. He could hear them descending, heavy movements on rock and then heavier impacts on the boulders at the hollow floor. More vocalizations, back and forth, the three new arrivals and the wounded one below. The pattern of the exchange settled into something that went on for 6 or 8 minutes. He could hear it clearly in the cold air of the narrow canyon. It had the rhythm of a structured exchange, pauses at intervals consistent with one party finishing and another responding, different registers distinguishable. He sat with his back against the white oak and listened to it, and after a while he stopped trying to analyze it and simply listened to it the way one listens to a program in a language you do not speak, taking in the sound as sound. The sounds stopped moving. The hollow went quiet. He sat against the oak for 30 minutes. After the last vocalization faded, 30 minutes of cold and dark, and his own breathing. Then he stood and walked north along the ridgeline to a section where the backslope was gentler and the descent was through more open timber, and he came down off the ridge in the last gray of the twilight and cut across to the creek and followed the Forest Service trail back to his truck on Forest Service Road 60. He sat in the truck with the engine off for close to half an hour. The windshield fogged slowly from the inside. He did not start the engine. He did not reach for his phone. He sat with his hands on his thighs and let the experience settle around him in the dark cab, and when the shaking in his hands had dropped to something he could manage, he drove home. He ate dinner. He sat at the kitchen table across from Arlene and told her everything. He did not hold any of it back. The blood trail and the change in it. The handprint on the boulder, the being under the bluff, its wound, its posture, the amber eyes, the fact that his hands had never moved toward his rifle, the vocalizations, the directed gaze between the rim and himself, the climb out of the hollow and the shapes at the rim, and the sounds of the group descending into the hollow below him. Arlene listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a period that lasted long enough that he wondered if she was waiting for him to say something more. Then she asked if he had been frightened. He said yes, a kind of fear that was different from anything he had felt in the woods before. Not the immediate danger kind of fear, though that was present as well. The kind that comes from not understanding what you are looking at, and from knowing in that moment that not understanding had been genuinely dangerous. She said she believed him. She said it directly and without qualification. She said she had never known him to describe something he had not experienced, and she was not going to start doubting him now. But she said she needed time to think about what it meant, because her understanding of the world also had a gap that this information was sitting inside, and she needed to figure out how to hold it. He did not sleep much that night. The next morning he called Dewey. He said something had happened in the hollow and he needed to talk in person. They met at a diner in Double Springs that afternoon. Lonnie told him everything, the whole account, from the limestone shelf to the truck. Dewey listened without asking questions while Lonnie was talking. When Lonnie finished, Dewey was quiet for a long time. The waitress came and refilled their coffee and went away. Then Dewey asked 2 questions. He asked if Lonnie had been drinking before he went in. Lonnie said no. Dewey asked if the wound could have been a rifle round. Lonnie said he did not think so. The wound looked like something had been wrapped around the flank and cut through the tissue when the one in the snare wrenched itself free. A tearing wound, not a ballistic wound. The edges were torn, not fragmented in the way a bullet wound fragments. Dewey nodded. He said he believed Lonnie. He said it without hesitation. And then he said what Lonnie had not expected. He said he did not want to go back into that hollow, either of them. Lonnie said he had not been planning to. They have not gone back, either of them. What Lonnie found on the face of the bluff when he was climbing out, which came back to him clearly the morning after the encounter, was a cable snare remnant. It had been caught on a sandstone outcropping about 4 feet up the rock face. The steel cable looped at one end around the rock and frayed and pulled apart at the other end, in the way that heavy-gauge cable fails when an anchor is overwhelmed, rather than when the line is cut clean. A loop of steel cable, roughly 3/8 of an inch diameter, the type used in heavy-duty feral hog snares throughout rural Alabama. Feral hog management is a genuine, practical concern across much of rural Alabama and has been for decades. The invasive swine population causes millions of dollars in agricultural and ecological damage annually, and property owners and wildlife managers use various control measures, including cable snares, to manage populations on specific parcels. The snares are legal on private land with appropriate authorization. They are not a permitted control method in the Sipsey wilderness under any authorization available to a private operator. Setting a cable snare in a federally designated wilderness area without a Forest Service permit is a federal violation. The snare at the base of that bluff had been set illegally, and whatever got caught in it was something considerably larger and considerably stronger than a feral hog. Lonnie reported the snare to the Forest Service law enforcement office covering the Bankhead. He described finding a cable snare in the wilderness area while deer hunting and reported the general location. He did not mention what he had found. He was clear about this when he discussed it with us. He reported the snare because illegal trapping in a designated wilderness area was a genuine conservation violation, and he had a civic instinct about reporting it. He did not mention it because the conversation that would have followed would not have served any purpose he could see. The Forest Service responded. A law enforcement officer hiked in to the location Lonnie had identified. He found the snare, still caught on the outcropping. He found the wooden anchor stake that had been driven into the ground at the base of the bluff. He found the blood, pooled and smeared under the overhang, and trailing south through the hollow, in the direction of the route Lonnie had taken out. The officer filed an incident report. The report characterized the blood evidence as consistent with a large animal, possibly black bear, that had been caught in the snare and wrenched free, sustaining significant injury in the process. Tracks present at the site were described as consistent with black bear. The illegal snare was removed. No suspect was identified. The investigation was closed. Black bear tracks in the Bankhead area have a maximum length, for the largest male bears, of approximately 8 to 9 inches. The front paw produces a broad, rounded impression with an asymmetrical toe arrangement, and the inner toe distinctly smaller than the others. A large male black bear standing on its hind legs reaches approximately 5.5 to 6 feet, which puts its maximum reach at perhaps 7 feet. Anyone familiar with black bear tracks from extensive field experience in the southeastern national forests knows what they look like and what they are capable of producing in soft substrate. Lonnie did not raise any objection to the report's attribution. He read the bear characterization and noted it internally, and said nothing further. If you have spent time in the Bankhead, in the Sipsey Fork drainage, or the Bee Branch corridor, or the Thompson Creek hollows, or anywhere in the bluff country of Lawrence and Winston counties, let me know in the comments. The reports coming out of that section of North Alabama go back considerably further than most people realize, and they form a pattern that connects what Lonnie found in that hollow to something much older and much harder to dismiss. The broader history of Dogman activity in North Alabama has not been compiled in any systematic way by any institution. This is partly a matter of demographics, and partly a matter of the specific cultural dynamics of the hill country of the southern Appalachian fringe. The people who use the Bankhead most consistently are locals, and local people in rural North Alabama are not culturally inclined to post unusual experiences on internet platforms or contact wildlife agencies with accounts they already know will not be taken seriously. They tell the people they trust and maintain those accounts within those circles. And within those circles, across Winston and Lawrence counties and the surrounding communities that have lived in relationship with the Bankhead for generations, there are stories about the Sipsey that are not about deer or turkey or the slowly recovering black bear population. Lonnie had heard some of those stories before November of 2018. He had sorted them into the category he applied to most hill country oral traditions of this type, the category of exaggeration applied to stories with a mundane explanation, and had grown in the telling, He had not paid them serious attention. After November of 2018, he revised that assessment entirely. The oldest account he eventually tracked down, through the informal social network of Winston County hunters and longtime families, came from a man who had worked as a timber cruiser in the Bankhead in the late 1950s, decades before the wilderness designation closed the interior to mechanized equipment. This man had died in the early 2000s, but his family had heard his account of an encounter in a hollow south of the Sipsey Fork repeated enough times through their childhood that when a mutual acquaintance connected it to Lonnie's account, the family could describe it with specificity. The timber cruiser had followed a creek bottom into a hollow. Working a section of forest his company was evaluating, he had come around a bend in the creek and found something at the base of a bluff overhang that he described to his family as a creature that walked on two legs and had the head of a dog. He turned around and walked out. He did not finish the survey of that section. He told his company the terrain in that drainage was not accessible for commercial operations. The family knew the terrain was not the reason. The hollow he described is consistent with the hollow where Lonnie had his encounter. Not identical, but within the same drainage system, the same bluff country, the same cluster of rock house shelters along the same creek system, a 60-year gap between the two accounts. Two men who had no connection to each other and no knowledge of the other's experience, both describing the same hollow system and the same bluff overhangs and the same quality of eyes watching them from the base of the rock. This kind of cross-temporal consistency in independent accounts is what Lonnie found throughout the research he undertook in the winter after the encounter, and it is what the Dogman research community has been documenting across the Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest and the Appalachian Corridor for decades. Reports from the broader Bankhead area, collected through family histories and hunting community oral records, go back through the decades following the National Forest's establishment in 1918. There are accounts from the 1920s and 30s that describe encounters in the deep hollows of the Sipsey country with large, upright canine beings that the people who encountered them had no framework to process. These accounts survived in family oral tradition rather than in any written record. The people who had the encounters were farmers and timber workers and hunters. They processed the experience within the cultural and religious frameworks available to them, which generally meant a quiet acknowledgement that the deep hollows contained things that were not to be trifled with, and an adjustment in their behavior to reflect that knowledge. The informal result was a pattern of avoidance. People stopped camping in certain hollows. Hunters shifted their pressure to other sections of the drainage. Children were told, without specific explanation, to stay out of certain creek bottoms. No explicit agreement. No meeting was held. The knowledge passed through communities in the way all practical knowledge passes, through observation and repetition, and the correction of people who had not yet learned it. This behavioral adaptation, the informal territorial avoidance that communities develop around locations where encounters have occurred, is something Linda Godfrey documented extensively across the Great Lakes region during her 30 years of research. Communities in Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana that had experienced Dogman encounters in specific locations developed informal norms around those locations over time. People stopped camping there. Hunters avoided them. The practical result was a buffer zone around areas of established activity, not because anyone had made a conscious decision to create such a zone, but because the social transmission of avoidance behavior through family and community networks accomplished the same result without requiring any explicit acknowledgement of what was being avoided. Lonnie observed exactly this pattern in the specific history of the upper Sipsey Fork drainage. The hunters he knew who had hunted the Bankhead for decades had not consistently pushed into the tightest hollows, not the deepest slots where the bluffs closed in on both sides. The reason given, when a reason was given at all, was that the terrain was difficult and the hunting pressure low because the deer did not concentrate in those tight hollows in numbers that justified the effort. Lonnie had reason to believe, after November of 2018, that the difficulty of the terrain was not the whole story. The Cherokee people who occupied the North Alabama highlands before the removal of the 1830s and 40s understood the Sipsey country with a depth that has not survived in any publicly accessible form. Their settlements along the Tennessee River Valley extended south into the hill country of what are now Lawrence and Winston and Cullman counties. The upper drainage of the Black Warrior River system which includes the Sipsey Fork, was Cherokee hunting ground for generations before European contact, and the Cherokee understanding of what lived in the deep hollows of the gorge country was not limited to the biological species that any current management agency recognizes. Mooney's documentation of Cherokee oral traditions in the 1890s describes the deep forest of the Southern Highlands as occupied territory in ways that go beyond biological inventory. Specific drainages and hollows were recognized as the claimed spaces of beings that had been on the land before the Cherokee, and that operated by territorial logic the Cherokee had learned to work around through long experience. The appropriate response to those territories was not confrontation and not ceremonial engagement. It was practical recognition. A hunter who needed to cross claimed ground did so quickly and without lingering. Game was not pursued into certain hollows. This was the kind of practical ecological knowledge that the Cherokee maintained about all significant presences in their landscape, and it was applied to these beings with the same precision. It was applied to bear habitat or elk migration corridors. The beings were real. Their territories were real. The protocols that governed encounters with them were real and had been developed through real outcomes over generations. The removal of the Cherokee from North Alabama did not remove what they had been working around. It removed the people who had mapped the territory and understood the protocols. What moved into the Bankhead Highlands in their place was a culture that had no knowledge of what the hollows contained, and no institutional framework for developing that knowledge, even if individual members of that culture had encounters that would have provided it. This is the context in which Lonnie found himself standing 8 feet from an amber-eyed dogman in a sandstone hollow in November of 2018, at the end of a long chain of encounters that stretched back through generations of people who had entered that country and found the same thing, some of whom had understood what they found and most of whom had not, all of whom had carried the knowledge in silence because the systems around them had no place for it. The winter of 2018 into 2019 was the period during which Lonnie processed the encounter in the closest approximation of systematic investigation that he was capable of alone. He was not, by his own description, a research-oriented person before November of 2018. He was an outdoorsman and a practical person whose relationship with books and extended reading was primarily functional. The encounter changed that. He started looking for anything that described what he had seen, in any format he could find. He found Linda Godfrey's work within the first few weeks. Godfrey, the Wisconsin journalist who began investigating the Bray road beast sightings near Elkhorn, Wisconsin in 1991, after an article she wrote for a local paper, opened what she described as a continuing flood of similar reports from across the region, spent 30 years compiling and analyzing dogman encounters from the Great Lakes and beyond. Her methodology was that of an investigative journalist applying serious professional standards to material the mainstream media treated as spectacle at best. She interviewed witnesses. She cross-referenced accounts. She tracked the behavioral consistencies that appeared across hundreds of independent reports from people who had no knowledge of each other's accounts and who had nothing obvious to gain from fabricating similar stories. What Lonnie found in Godfrey's work was a description of the dogman he had seen under the Sipsey Bluff, rendered in different language from different geographies, but with a specificity that produced a specific physical response when he read it. The amber eye shine, the upright posture, the canine head with forward-facing eyes, and the muzzle extending from the eye line in the way a dog's skull is oriented, not a bear's skull and not a human skull. The physical dimensions, the dark fur, the individual articulated fingers with narrow claw tips, the intelligence visible in the attention being directed at the observer, the restraint when attack was clearly possible. All of this was in Godfrey's documentation of Great Lakes accounts, drawn from witnesses describing Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana, 2,000 miles from the Sipsey Wilderness in North Alabama. He read through the night on multiple occasions that winter. Arlene noticed. She did not ask him to stop or ask him directly what he was reading, but she left a light on in the kitchen for the nights when he was up past 2 and made sure there was coffee in the morning without making anything of it. They had been married long enough that she knew the difference between the kind of processing he could do in conversation and the kind he had to do alone, and she gave him the space for the alone kind without withdrawing from him while he was doing it. The Steve Cook discovery was the thing that disturbed Lonnie in a specific way he had not anticipated. Cook, the The Michigan radio disc jockey who wrote The Legend in 1987 as a calculated April Fool's fabrication had invented the entire thing from nothing, written a song describing it, and played it on the air as a prank. He had invented the bipedal canine. He had invented the amber eye shine. He had invented the forest territory, the nocturnal behavior, the physical dimensions. He had made all of it up, and the station's phone lines had been overwhelmed with calls from people who recognized in the song's description something they had personally experienced. People who had never known there was a name for it. People who had been carrying their accounts in silence for years because they had nothing to file them under. The song did not create the phenomenon. The song gave the phenomenon a name and gave witnesses the permission structure to acknowledge it. What disturbed Lonnie was that Cook had invented the details and had apparently accidentally gotten them exactly right. The amber eyes, the upright posture, the canine head profile, the territorial forest behavior. The size. A disc jockey in Traverse City, Michigan, in 1987, inventing a radio prank character, producing a description that matched what hundreds of people across the Great Lakes region had seen independently, across decades, without knowing each other's accounts. There are two ways this can be explained. Either the Dogman is a cultural archetype that Cook tapped into from some collective source that also produced the independent sightings, or Cook invented a description of something that exists independently of his description of it. Lonnie had done enough reading by midwinter to know that the second explanation was supported by accounts that predated Cook's song by decades, and in one notable case by exactly 1 century. The Wexford County account from 1887 described 2 lumberjacks in the logging camps along the Manistee River in northern Michigan who encountered a being with a man's body and a dog's head, a being that moved on 2 legs and had amber eyes and displayed the kind of territorial presence that the Dogman research community has been documenting in one form or another across the entire intervening period. The behavioral characteristics of the 1887 Wexford County account, the upright posture, the amber eye shine, the territorial presence, the restraint when attack was possible, match the characteristics of what Lonnie found under the Sipsey Bluff in November of 2018, with a specificity that 130 years of distance and 2,000 miles of geography should not produce if both accounts are fabricated. The consistency argues against fabrication. The consistency argues for something real that has been on the North American continent for longer than any institutional framework has been prepared to recognize. The Cherokee knew it was in the hollows of the North Alabama highlands. The lumberjacks in Michigan encountered it in 1887. Linda Godfrey documented it across the Great Lakes, from the 1890s through the present, and in November of 2018 it was in a hollow in the William B. Bankhead National Forest in Winston County, Alabama, braced against a sandstone bluff face, bleeding from an illegal snare wound, warning a hunter to leave before the rest of the group came down from the rim. What Dewey told Lonnie at the Double Springs Diner was something he had not volunteered during the phone call and would not have volunteered that afternoon if Lonnie had not told his own account first. He delivered it quickly, flatly, the way people deliver information they have been carrying alone and have decided to put down. He said that about 6 years before November of 2018, during archery season, he had been on stand on a ridge above the Thompson Creek drainage, a different ridge from Lonnie's position, but in the same general area. He had been there for 2 hours when he heard something moving on the ridgeline below him with a footfall weight and rhythm that did not belong to a deer. The steps were too heavy and too evenly spaced for an animal moving on 4 legs. He stayed on his stand and watched the ridgeline below him for the better part of 20 minutes. He saw a shape moving along the far side of the ridge through a screen of young hardwoods, upright, covering ground on 2 legs with a long, ground-eating stride that was nothing he had seen in 30 years of hunting. He lost it when it crossed the ridge and dropped into the adjacent hollow. He drove home and told himself he had seen a person in dark hunting clothes moving along the far ridgeline. He had known it was not a person. He had not told Lonnie. 6 years. 6 years of hunting the same country with the same partner, and nothing. Lonnie asked him why. Dewey said what everyone in every similar account eventually says, expressed in the particular way of his own personality. He said he did not want to be that person, the person who sees things in the woods, That phrase is the most powerful mechanism in the entire system of silence that surrounds this phenomenon. Not institutional suppression and not active conspiracy, but the individual rational calculation that every credible person in a small community makes when they weigh the cost of disclosure against the cost of silence. The cost of disclosure is asymmetric and immediate. You report an encounter with a large upright canine in the Sipsey Fork drainage, and you become the person who reports encounters with large upright canines in the Sipsey Fork drainage. The reputation adjustment is immediate and durable. In a county of 24,000 people, where professional and social networks are tight and long-memoried, that reputation adjustment costs something real. The cost of silence is internal, private, carried alone, and invisible to the community around you. The rational economic calculation in a small community almost always comes down on the side of silence. Dewey made that calculation for 6 years. The only reason it ended in the Double Springs diner on a November Friday was that Lonnie had told him something first. The Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries Division manages game and non-game wildlife in the state through surveys, regulations, and coordination with federal land management agencies. Their species list for the North Alabama highlands is extensive and generally accurate. It includes white-tailed deer, wild turkey, American black bear, feral hog as an invasive species, coyote, bobcat, gray fox, red fox, beaver, river otter, and numerous smaller mammals and birds. What it does not include is a classification for an apex predator that leaves tracks larger than any black bear recorded in Alabama, that maintains defined territories with behavioral evidence of long-term habitation, and that demonstrated sufficient cognitive capacity to direct communicative behavior across species at a human in a tight hollow in November of 2018. The reason this gap exists is structural rather than malicious. Species management begins with species recognition. Recognition requires documentation. Documentation requires that someone with institutional authority engage with evidence in a formal scientific process. For that engagement to happen, evidence has to reach the right people through the right channels. The reporting channels are designed to receive reports about recognized species. Accounts of things outside the recognized species list go to a general intake log that generates no systematic follow-up, because there is no protocol for investigating reports of unclassified large predators in Alabama, because the protocol was designed to manage the species that are on the list, and the species on the list was assembled without the information that would make a new entry necessary. The loop closes without breaking. If Lonnie had walked into the Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries Regional Office in Decatur after the encounter and described what he had seen in the hollow, the conversation would have followed a course he could have predicted. The officer would have listened politely. They would have referenced the black bear encounter protocol, which is the nearest available category for large mammal encounters in North Alabama. They would have noted the account in a general log, and nothing further would have happened, because there is no investigation protocol in the Alabama DNR for an encounter with an undocumented large bipedal canine, and there is no one in the agency whose job description includes initiating one. The Forest Service investigation of the illegal snare demonstrated this pattern exactly. The blood was there. The volume of it exceeded what a trapped feral hog would produce. The tracks were there, whatever their measurements were in the official record, and the report filed those facts under the nearest available category and closed the case. Not because the officer was incompetent, because the institutional framework within which that officer worked has specific categories for large animal evidence in the Bankhead, and the evidence fell outside those categories, and the path of least institutional resistance was attribution to the nearest familiar species. Black bears are present in the Bankhead and recovering in population. A bear-attributed blood trail and a bear-attributed set of tracks fits within the existing information architecture of the Forest Service's incident documentation system. An undocumented large bipedal canine does not fit anywhere in that architecture. There is no form for it. There is no field to enter it into. There is no supervisor who wants to receive a report that contains it. The Sipsey Wilderness has been managed as federally designated wilderness for nearly 50 years. In that time, Forest Service employees, Wildlife biologists, law enforcement officers, and trail crew workers have spent hundreds of thousands of person-hours in and around the Bankhead. Some of them have found evidence they could not explain. Some have had encounters they did not report. Some have filed incident reports that attributed unexplained evidence to the nearest available category without fully believing the attribution. The accumulated weight of those individual decisions, each one defensible on its own institutional merits, is a system-wide inability to see what the Cherokee saw for generations and what Lonnie saw in November of 2018. The question of what the warning required of the wounded creature is the one Lonnie has returned to more consistently than any other element of the encounter. It is not the one that is easiest to think about. The warning required that a severely injured being, braced against a bluff face in significant pain, in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic escape from a mechanical trap, in a narrow hollow with no quick exit, maintain sufficient cognitive capacity to assess the presence of a human, assess the approach of its own group from above, recognize the conflict between those two facts, and direct behavior at the human that was specifically calculated to produce the human's departure before the group arrived. Every step of that sequence requires cognitive resources. The being was depleted. It was hurting. It was in a compromised state that would, in most animals, produce either aggressive defense or complete withdrawal of attention from anything not an immediate threat. Instead, it ran what amounted to a directional communication protocol with a species it was not a member of. It identified the human as the variable in the situation that could be influenced. It used a behavioral and vocal mechanism to communicate directional information across a species barrier. And the mechanism worked. Lonnie understood it. He acted on it. He left. What that sequence implies about what the beings in the Sipsey know about humans is what sits at the center of everything Lonnie has struggled to process. Its behavior was not instinctive in any sense that instinct applies to known wildlife. A dog does not perform a directed gaze protocol between a threat source and a companion who needs to be warned. A coyote does not sequence vocalizations to communicate directional information to a human in a stressful situation. What Lonnie watched unfold in that hollow was the application of a cognitive model that the being clearly held about how humans process information. A model sophisticated enough to produce a communication strategy that succeeded. That kind of cognitive modeling requires extended observation. It requires something that can watch humans over time, learn how they process environmental information, and apply that learning to the construction of a strategy. It requires, in short, a long accumulated understanding of us that could only come from watching us carefully for a very long time. The question this raises about the nature of what lives in the Sipsey Fork drainage is one that Lonnie has circled many times without arriving at a satisfying answer. He does not believe they have human intelligence applied through a non-human body. He has read enough of the research literature to know that the behavioral record suggests more like territorial intelligence, the intelligence of a social predator with a long memory and a strong capacity for pattern recognition and strategic application. But the communication in the hollow was not territorial strategy in the narrow sense of that term. It was an orientation specifically toward the human's well-being, or at least toward a resolution that resulted in the human's safety. Whether that orientation was intentional and directed, or was the product of the Dogman managing its situation so that it happened to benefit Lonnie, is a question he genuinely cannot answer. Arlene approached this question in a manner that surprised him, which was methodically and empirically over the course of the winter and spring following the encounter. She was not an outdoors person in the way Lonnie was, and she had no personal experience of the kind of attention a wild thing can give you at close range. But she had a practical, clear-headed intelligence that she applied to the question of the warning with the same rigor she applied to everything that mattered to her. She read about animal cognition. She read about documented interspecies communication in other contexts. She worked through the implications of the encounter systematically and arrived, by spring, at a position that she described to Lonnie as settled enough to stop actively revisiting. She said she was not prepared to assign intentionality to the warning in the way she would assign intentionality to a considered human act, but she was also not prepared to attribute it to coincidence, because coincidence requires a plausible mechanism, and the mechanism of coincidental communication via structured vocalization and directed gaze across a species barrier in a high-stress encounter with a severely injured being did not have a plausible mechanism she could construct. She said she had landed on this. Whatever produced the behavior was oriented toward Lonnie's departure, and Lonnie's departure was the correct outcome for everyone in that hollow. That was enough for her to hold. The August of 2021 encounter reintroduced the material on terms Lonnie had not expected and had not prepared for. He had, by that point, organized the November 2018 encounter into something he could carry without constant disruption. He thought about it. He did not obsess about it. He had Arlene, and he had the reading he had done, and he had Dewey's quiet acknowledgement, and those three things had created a structure around the experience that allowed him to live alongside it without it consuming him daily. The structure was imperfect. It required maintenance. But it functioned. He was driving a county road along the western edge of the Bankhead boundary in the late evening in August, returning from a work-related stop on a contract that had run late, windows down in the summer heat. The road runs along the boundary between the National Forest and a series of private timber holdings, with the forest to the right as he drove north and private land to the left. The distance between the road and the interior of the Sipsey wilderness at that section is roughly 2 miles of national forest. No structures between the road and the wilderness boundary, no agricultural land, just national forest, descending from the county road level into the creek drainage that eventually becomes the gorge country. The sound came from the forest to his right. He slowed the truck before his conscious mind had classified what he was hearing, as the body responds to something familiar that the mind has not yet caught up with. Low, structured, the same tonal character as what he had heard in the hollow nearly 3 years earlier. Not identical, different enough in specific pattern and register that he understood it as a different individual, not the same individual he had encountered in the hollow, but the same category of sound, the same instrument, producing a different piece. He stopped the truck, rolled both windows up, and locked the doors. Sat there for a few minutes. The sound did not repeat. The forest beside the road was completely still in the specific way he had learned to recognize from the hollow. Not wind stillness, but the stillness of a forest where the wildlife has quieted for a reason. He drove home. He told Arlene that evening. She had been through enough of this by then that her response was measured and practical. She asked if he was all right. He said yes. She asked if he wanted to talk about it further. He said not that night. She left it there. She had learned that the processing he did around this particular subject was primarily internal, and that her role was to be available rather than to initiate. What the August 2021 incident established, as a piece of evidence that Lonnie has turned over many times since, is that the territory in use extends beyond the hollow where the encounter occurred and beyond the immediate area of the Sipsey Fork drainage. The county road where he heard the vocalization borders the National Forest 2 miles from the wilderness boundary. Between the road and the interior of the Sipsey, there is nothing except national forest. Whatever produced the sound was somewhere in that 2-mile strip of national forest, moving along the corridor between the more protected interior habitat and the forest edge where human activity is sparse but not absent. This is consistent with what the research literature describes as territorial edge behavior, the use of marginal habitat zones as movement corridors by species that maintain core territories in more protected interior areas. But it is also consistent with something more intentional, a being that has mapped the boundary between the forest and the human world, and uses the corridor between them with the same intentionality it brings to everything else. Lonnie observed it doing. The beings in that drainage are not contained by the wilderness boundary. They were not contained by the National Forest boundary in August of 2021. They move where they have always moved, along the corridors of the landscape that existed before the management frameworks were drawn around them. Lonnie retired from his contracting work about 2 years after the August incident. He was not quite at the age where retirement had been the plan, but the contractor he had worked for was winding down the operation as the principal owner approached his own retirement, and the terms of the agreement that brought the operation to a close were reasonable enough to accept. He took the settlement and stepped away. He says the timing was not connected to anything related to the Bankhead. He may be right about this. He may not be. The question he cannot fully answer, and does not try to, is whether the years of living alongside the knowledge of what was in that hollow had gradually changed his relationship to the work that brought him to the forest boundary every day. The hardest part of his current situation, which he describes without self-pity but with a directness that makes clear he has thought about it carefully, is the arithmetic involving his adult son. His son is in his early 30s. He hunts. He hunted the Bankhead with Lonnie through his teens and early 20s, and continues to hunt the National Forest on his own, including sections of the Sipsey Fork drainage. He sets trail cameras on public land. He goes into the forest alone during archery season in October and during the rut week in November. He goes in with the confidence of someone who knows the terrain and understands the wildlife as he has always understood it, which is to say, with the confidence of someone operating on an incomplete inventory of what the forest contains. Lonnie has not told him. He has considered it many times. The ethical case for telling him is straightforward. His son is walking into terrain that contains something he has not been given the information to be appropriately careful around. A parent who has relevant safety information and withholds it from an adult child who would benefit from having it is making an ethical choice that is difficult to defend in the abstract. Lonnie understands this. He does not defend it in the abstract. He defends it specifically. He knows his son. He knows that his son's response to being told there is a dogman in the upper Sipsey Fork drainage would not be to avoid the upper Sipsey Fork drainage. It would be to go looking for it. The combination of physical confidence and curiosity, and the specific kind of belief that a son extends to a father's word, would produce exactly that result. And the scenario in which his son goes into one of those tight hollows with a trail camera and a rifle, and the intention of finding what his father described to him is a scenario that Lonnie cannot contemplate without a kind of dread that goes well beyond ordinary parental worry. He carries this arithmetic alongside everything else. It does not resolve. He suspects it will not resolve in any way that produces a clean answer. The beings Lonnie observed in that hollow, the wounded individual, and the 3 who came down from the rim, had been on that land since before any of the management frameworks that now govern it were conceived. The Wild and Scenic River designation of 1988, the Wilderness designation of 1975, the Bankhead National Forest establishment of 1918, the treaties of removal in the 1830s and 40s, the first permanent European settlements in the North Alabama highlands in the 1780s and 90s. Each of these frameworks arrived to govern land that was already occupied by beings whose relationship to that landscape predated the frameworks by more time than the frameworks were designed to contemplate. The Pottsville sandstone of the bluff walls is 320 million years old. The hemlocks along the creek banks in the deepest hollows predate the National Forest by centuries. The creek that runs along the base of the bluff, where Lonnie stood in the dark, has been running in the same channel since the last glaciation reshaped the drainage geometry of North Alabama 12,000 years ago. Against this scale of time, the 106 years of the Bankhead National Forest is nothing. The 186 years since the Cherokee removal is nothing. The 300 years of European engagement with the North Alabama highlands is nothing. Whatever has been living in those hollows has been doing so across a duration that contains all of that history and extends in both directions beyond it. The fact that sits at the center of everything Lonnie has processed since November of 2018 is not any specific element of the encounter. It is the implication of the encounter taken as a whole. The thing he stood 8 feet from in the dark was in that hollow, and in hollows like it in the Sipsey Fork drainage, for longer than his family had been in Winston County, longer than Winston County had existed as a county, longer than there had been a name for North Alabama at all. It was there before the Cherokee mapped its territory in the language that James Mooney documented a generation after the removal. It was there before the Cherokee. It was there when the first human beings looked at the sandstone bluffs of the Sipsey Gorge and recognized the same value in the overhanging rock shelters that the beings recognized and began using for the same basic purpose: shelter, proximity to water, ground that was defensible and dry and cold in the right ways and protected in the right ways for the species that needed it. Lonnie asked one thing at the end of our conversations. He asked that we leave out the specific location of the hollow, the tributary name, the approach route from Forest Service Road 60, the landscape features that would allow someone familiar with the Sipsey drainage to identify the specific overhang. He was clear that the request was not about protecting himself. He has protected himself by not going back, and by maintaining his account within the short list of people who have earned it. The request was about the beings. If the specific location became known, he said, the wrong people would go in. Hunters looking for a different kind of proof. Researchers looking for documentation. People who would push into the narrow hollow with equipment and intentions and force the group into a confrontation that had not been necessary, that the warning had been specifically designed to prevent, and that could not end well for anyone involved in it, on either side of the species line. He said it had given him something in that hollow. Whether the warning was intentional, whether the directed gaze and the structured vocalizations and the alternating attention between the rim and himself were the product of an intentional communicative decision or the product of something managing its situation such that Lonnie correctly interpreted it. The practical result was that he left before the group arrived, and he is alive to be having this conversation. The least he could do with that was protect the specific location. He thought of it as a small payment against a debt that did not have a number attached to it. The Sipsey Fork of the Black Warrior River runs cold and clear and tea-dark from the tannins in the leaf litter through the gorge system of the William B. Bankhead National Forest, protected by its wild and scenic designation, enclosed by its wilderness boundary, managed by the Forest Service, under a plan that accounts for every species, whose existence the plan was designed to account for. The hemlocks grow along the north-facing creek banks in the deep canyon hollows where the light barely reaches. The sandstone bluffs hold their rock house shelters in the same overhanging geometry they have held for 320 million years of geological time, unchanged by the wilderness designation, or the wild and scenic river corridor, or any other management framework that human governance has produced in the century since the Bankhead became a national forest. And in certain hollows, in the narrow slots where the bluffs close in and the cold air settles, and the light fails 2 hours before it fails on the ridgelines above, something moves that has been moving through this landscape since before any document in any archive describes North Alabama in any language at all. A being that watched the Cherokee learn to work around its territory, and watched the settlers move in, and watched the loggers come through, and watched the Forest Service arrive to manage what the loggers left. One that has adapted to every human incursion into its habitat by becoming more careful and more selective and more strategic, by learning the patterns of the people who enter the forest and adjusting its movements accordingly, by maintaining an existence so precisely calibrated to the margins of human awareness that the evidence it leaves behind gets attributed to bear, and the file gets closed, and the management plan gets updated with nothing changed. One that understood, in November of 2018, that the man standing 8 feet from it in the dark needed to leave before the rest of the group came down from the rim. One that communicated this in the only way available to it, clearly enough that the man understood and acted on it in time. What it thinks about us, and what it has concluded from the centuries of watching, is not a question that has an answer available to human inquiry. What Lonnie concluded from one direct encounter is that it has decided, at least in the territory it occupies in the upper Sipsey Fork drainage, to manage its relationship with the humans who pass through its ground with the minimum necessary communication. It warns before it forces. It communicates before it acts. It allows the people who recognize the message to leave. This is not goodwill in the sense that goodwill implies warmth or care for the other party. It is something colder and more practical than that. It is the intelligence of a territorial being that understands the costs of conflict well enough to prefer the communication that avoids it. Whatever those in the Sipsey have concluded about the terms on which they and the people who enter their ground can share the same watershed, it is a working arrangement. It is not written down anywhere. It is not formalized. It exists in the behavioral choices the beings make when they encounter humans in their territory, and in the stories that people like Lonnie and Dewey carry in silence afterward, and in the adjustments those people make to their own behavior in response to an encounter they cannot disclose. The Cherokee held this knowledge in oral tradition across generations, passed it through community structures that were designed to maintain it, applied it as practical guidance for everyone who entered the forest. That institutional knowledge is gone. What replaced it is this: an informal and undocumented and entirely fragile working arrangement between a retired county road contractor in Winston County, Alabama, and the most significant undocumented predator on the continent, maintained by a combination of mutual avoidance and, when avoidance fails, the kind of cross-species communication that Lonnie experienced under a sandstone bluff on a November afternoon and has been working to understand ever since. He does not know if the arrangement will hold indefinitely. He does not know what increased recreational pressure on the Sipsey wilderness means for beings whose survival has always depended on the margins of human awareness being wide enough for them to exist inside. He does not know what the continuing incursion of illegal trapping operations into the wilderness area means for the social stability of groups that manage their relationship with the human world with a precision that a cable snare through the flank disrupts catastrophically. He only knows what he saw and heard in November of 2018, and what he heard in August of 2021 from a truck window on the county road, and what both of those things have cost him to carry. Amber eyes in the dark, a warning delivered across a species barrier with nothing but structured vocalization and a directed gaze. Shapes at the rim of a sandstone bluff against the last light of a November sky, descending into the hollow he had just left, and the sound, rising from the hollow floor 40 feet below him, of a group of beings communicating with each other about a conversation that included him, on terms he will never fully know, in a language that no institution in the state of Alabama is equipped to receive. The descent into the hollow on that Thursday afternoon had a quality that Lonnie has tried to describe to himself many times since, and never gotten entirely right in words. The change was not dramatic. It was incremental, the way the light shifts in a room when a cloud crosses the sun. Easy to dismiss each individual step, and suddenly much further along than you realized you had gotten. He had been in that hollow dozens of times across the years. He knew what it sounded like in mid-November. He knew the specific quality of silence that a cold afternoon in a tight bluff hollow produces when the thermals have settled and the wind is not reaching the canyon floor. He knew the difference between that kind of quiet and what was there that afternoon. The difference was in the bottom register, the sounds that are below the threshold of attention in a functioning forest, the constant low-grade presence of small life moving through the duff and the canopy and the log piles. All of it was absent, not diminished. Absent. In its place was a quality the body registered before the mind did, the way the body processes changes in barometric pressure before they produce any identifiable sensation. He was 20 minutes into the hollow and 50 feet below the ridgeline when he noticed that his pace had slowed without any decision to slow it. He was walking more carefully than he had been. His attention had sharpened beyond what efficient movement through familiar terrain normally requires. He stopped and listened, and could not assign any specific cause to the change. He kept moving. The beech ridge that runs along the upper portion of the hollow before the terrain drops sharply into the hemlock zone below produces a specific kind of leaf litter in November. Large, pale leaves gone the color of dry paper, the kind that carry sound in all directions when a boot catches them wrong. Lonnie had learned early in his seasons on this ground to move along the leaf-covered slopes, with his weight distributed differently than on bare ground. His stride shortened, his foot placement careful. He applied this practice automatically that afternoon, the way practice skills apply themselves without conscious instruction. He moved quietly through the beech zone and into the hemlock zone below, where the ground changed character entirely. Under the hemlocks, the accumulated duff of many seasons deadened sound. The light changed too, flatter and cooler under the dense hemlock canopy than it had been on the open beech slope above, the kind of light that a north-facing slope under old hemlocks produces in November, close enough to darkness that the headlamp would have been useful already if he had been inclined to use it. He was not yet. He knew this section of the hollow well enough to move through it without a headlamp for another 20 minutes. The limestone shelf where he first found the blood was a feature he had used as a directional marker for years. A flat outcropping of pale limestone intrusive through the sandstone, maybe 12 feet across and 4 feet above the creek level, the surface water smooth from seasonal flooding, and pale enough to read as a landmark in poor light. He had eaten lunch on that shelf on 2 separate October mornings. He knew its surface well. He saw the blood before he had fully registered that he was looking at the shelf, saw it as a change in the surface texture that resolved into color as he got closer, and knew what it was before he had consciously identified it. He crouched at the edge of the shelf and looked at the pattern. Spatter, droplets with forward momentum, carrying the directionality of a running animal. He oriented himself to the direction the droplets pointed and calculated the approach angle. The animal had come from the north side of the hollow, from the direction of the ridge that ran above Thompson Creek, and had been moving south along the hollow floor, moving fast. The droplets had length to them, stretched in the direction of travel. An animal that was scared and covering ground, not an animal lying down and bleeding into one place. The volume of blood on the shelf was substantial for a deer. He noted this but assigned it to the context of a double lung or heart shot by a hunter on the far side of the ridge, the kind of terminal hit that produces a running animal rather than a dropping one. He began tracking south. The trail held its character for the first 100 yards. Dark blood, intermittent, drying in the November cold to a brown at the edges. He moved along it at a pace that a competent deer tracker uses in difficult terrain, reading 4 or 5 yards ahead for the next indicator, while keeping the current one in peripheral attention, building a continuous picture of the animal's movement, rather than moving from spot to spot in isolation. This was tracking he had done many times. He was comfortable in it. At a point where the hollow floor narrowed and the bluff walls on both sides approached within 30 yards of each other, the trail changed. The first sign was not blood, but an absence. The trail went cold for a 12-foot gap, the spacing between indicators suddenly too wide for the pattern he had been following. He stopped and looked at the ground ahead and to both sides, and found the next indicator on the creek side of the hollow floor, off the direct line of the previous trail, as if the animal had turned sharply and moved toward the water. He followed the offset and found the next indicator beyond it, and realized the animal was no longer moving in a straight line. It was moving in a pattern consistent with an animal that had slowed significantly, that was choosing its path rather than running it. The volume of blood per indicator had increased. He looked ahead into the hemlock zone. The hollow was at its tightest here, the bluffs pressing in from both sides with the overhang beginning to develop on the right wall. The creek squeezed into a slot along the left side between the bluff base and a boulder field. The hemlock canopy, old growth in this section, blocked most of what remained of the afternoon light. His headlamp came on. The cone of light changed the hollow. Visible terrain is one environment. The same terrain under a headlamp beam is another. The contrast heightened, the shadows deeper on each side of the beam. The field of vision narrowed to what the lamp illuminates at the expense of everything beyond it. He moved more slowly. The lamp played across the boulder surfaces as he passed them, illuminating the pale face of the Pottsville sandstone, the dark wet face of the hemlock bark, the brown tangle of root systems where the creek bank had eroded under repeated flooding. He was reading the ground ahead for blood sign when the lamp crossed the boulder. He stopped, came back to it, put the beam full on the flat upper surface. The smear was 18 inches long. The volume of it was not dear. He looked at it for a long moment, the lamp steady, the hollow silent around him except for the creek to his left and his own breathing. He reached the edge of the boulder and looked at the smear from above it. The edges of the dried blood were dark and thick, the center of the smear still with a slight sheen even hours old, which meant the volume at the time of contact was enough to slow drying at the center even in cold air. He was looking at an amount of blood that represented a serious wound in an animal considerably larger than a white-tailed deer. Then, he saw the impression. He focused the lamp on it and did not move for what might have been a full minute. 5 digits. He counted them 3 times. The spacing between them was wider than a black bear front paw, by a margin that was obvious once he had oriented the impression in his mind. The thumb, set outside the palm at the inner edge of the impression, was in a position that no bear paw produces. It was separated from the finger line by a gap that implied opposition, the way a human thumb opposes the fingers. He looked at the claw marks at the tip of each digit. Narrow. Not the broad, blunt claw impressions a bear produces, not the spread raking claws of an animal built to dig and tear. Narrow and fairly uniform across all 5. The kind of impression a claw makes when pressing for purchase rather than applying force through the claw itself. He stood and looked ahead into the dark. The amber light was in the shadow under the overhang before his mind had resolved the geometry of what he was looking at. As the eye catches reflected light before the brain constructs the source. He stopped. He sorted through everything in the next 3 seconds that his mind offered as an explanation. Bear. He considered it and discarded it. The eye placement was wrong. The height of the reflection above the ground was wrong. He could feel the lamp beam shaking slightly. He steadied his arm. The shape assembled itself in the headlamp beam by increments, the way low-light images compose themselves, the most reflective surfaces first and then the structures around them. Amber eyes, a body upright against the sandstone bluff, the wound along the left flank, the matted fur, the pooled blood on the ground beneath, the ears, upright and pointed, tracking the light, the jaw, slightly open, the breath visible as vapor in the cold air of the hollow. He has described the first 5 seconds of visual contact many times, and the description is always consistent in the details that he clearly experienced directly, and varies in the interpretive elements that his subsequent knowledge has shaped. What is consistent? The height. The being was in contact with the sandstone bluff behind it, braced against it with its right shoulder, and the top of its skull was at the level of the overhang beginning, which he later measured from the ground on a subsequent scouting visit to the bluff before he made the decision not to return. The overhang begins at 7 feet 4 inches above the ground level at the base of the bluff. What is consistent? The breadth of the shoulders, which he estimates by comparison to the width of the bluff face, roughly twice the shoulder width of a large man. What is consistent? The wound, the left flank, from the hip bone area up toward the lower ribs, an open tear in the tissue visible through the matted fur, the flesh exposed, the color of it dark from the time elapsed since injury. What varied across his accounts in ways that reflected his processing rather than inconsistent memory. The quality of its expression. He has described it as pain-focused and then as broader than pain-focused. He has described it as watching him with predatory calculation and then corrected himself and said calculation was not the right word for it. He has described it as looking at him the way a reasoning thing looks at what it has already categorized and is no longer deciding about. That last version is the one he returns to most consistently, and the one that seems to most accurately reflect what he experienced in the moment, before the rational mind started working on it. He did not raise his rifle. He has given this fact consistent weight in every account. The weapon was there. He was carrying it, loaded, with his hand on the forestock the way he always carried it in the lower section of the hollow. He had a clear line to it. He was a competent shot at that range and under those conditions, and his hands did not move. He describes it as the absence of the impulse rather than the suppression of an impulse he had. The impulse was not there. Its posture, the quality of its attention, in the specific combination of its physical state and its behavioral presentation, produced in him a response that he locates not in conscious decision, but in a level below conscious decision, a kind of received communication. This is not a situation where the rifle is the tool. He stood with his hands at his sides and the lamp on it and let the encounter settle around him. His heart was loud. He was aware of his pulse in a physical way he rarely experienced in the woods, in his throat and his wrists and behind his ears. The cardiovascular system doing what it does when the body has made an assessment that the conscious mind is still catching up with. The cold of the hollow did not reach him for those first minutes. The adrenal response was keeping him warm, though it would later be followed by a cold that cut through everything he was wearing. But in those first minutes he was insulated from the temperature by chemistry. It breathed. He focused on that because it was the most comprehensible element of the encounter. Breathing, he understood. The rhythm of it was slower than his own, slower even than a resting human's, a deep and controlled cycle that did not change its pace when he arrived, or when the lamp found it, or through any of the minutes that followed. He listened to it and measured his own breathing against it, and made a careful effort to slow his toward its pace, the way you slow your breathing when you are trying to steady a shot. Not because he had a shot to make, because having one measurable thing under partial control was better than having nothing under control. For 2 minutes, by his estimate, they looked at each other. Then, its eyes moved. He tracked the movement with the lamp. The amber eyes shifted upward and to the left, up the face of the bluff toward the rim 40 feet above. The head turned with them, the long muzzle orienting upward and to the left in a movement so purposeful and so clearly directed that the direction itself was information. There was a presence above. He looked up reflexively, which is the involuntary human response to a directed gaze, the same reflex that makes you look when someone across a room stares at the ceiling. He saw nothing but the underside of the overhang and the pale strip of sky above the bluff rim. Then the vocalization came. He had been told to prepare for this before speaking with us, and he had agreed that he could not fully prepare someone, that you can describe the frequency range and the tonal quality and the structural organization, and the person will have a reasonable intellectual picture of it, and then they will hear it, and the intellectual picture will not have been adequate. He describes it as a sound that begins below the range at which the ear locates a point source, a sound that seems to come from the stone and the air simultaneously rather than from a specific throat in a specific location. The tonal variation within it is organized. He is clear about this. Not random. Not the continuous single-pitch call of a distressed being, or the rising inflection of a threat call. Organized. Multiple distinct tonal components with a defined structure, a beginning and a middle and an end that was distinguishable from the beginning. It repeated twice without variation. Then the third iteration changed. The middle section changed. The ending changed. The beginning stayed the same and then shifted. He had no framework for it. He stood in the cone of his headlamp in the cold hollow and listened to structured sound produced by a thing he had no name for 8 feet away from him, and he did not run. Its eyes came back to his face when the vocalization ended. For a moment the amber eyes held him. Then they moved to the rim above. Then back to him. He watched this happen. The sequence repeated. Rim, him. Rim, him. Each individual movement measured and paced. Not the rapid scanning of a startled thing, but the focused attention of one making a point. He stood in the dark and let his mind work on what it was receiving. And the mind arrived, after 4 repetitions of the sequence, at the interpretation that fit better than anything else available. It was not doing 2 things at once. It was doing one thing. It was directing his attention between 2 locations as a communicative act. There was a presence above them. The rim and him in the rim, you, up there, you, up there. He took a step back. The amber eyes came immediately and fully to him. He stopped. The eyes held him for 3 seconds, which at that point in the encounter was long enough to feel significant. Then they moved to the rim, then back to him. The same sequence. Slower now, more emphatic in the alternation, as if the message had a sense of time attached to it. He turned and moved. He moved south through the hollow the way he had come in, not running, not even approximating a run, but moving at the fastest pace the terrain would support, while keeping his feet under him and his weight distributed correctly over the uneven creek-bottom ground. The headlamp was forward directed as he moved, and the shadows on either side of the beam were deep and moving as the lamp angle changed with each step. He did not look behind him. He focused the lamp on the ground ahead and put one foot in front of the other and covered the terrain as quickly as he could, without making the kind of mistake that the terrain was capable of producing if he asked too much of it. At the limestone shelf, he increased his pace. The ground was flatter there, and the creek was running alongside on a predictable course, and the lamp gave him better range of useful vision on the open shelf surface. He went across it in a near jog and back into the beech leaf terrain above and through it, the dry leaves loud under his feet in a way he was beyond caring about, and when he reached the section of the hollow where the bluff height stepped down to a climbable grade, he turned to the right, toward the sandstone face. He had been up this route twice before, in daylight, with a day pack, and no particular urgency. The route was a series of natural ledges and horizontal cracks in the sandstone face, wide enough to stand on if you knew where they were, connected by sections where the hand placement mattered more than the foot placement, and your weight had to be managed carefully against the angle of the rock. He turned his lamp off before he touched the rock, not because he had thought through the tactical implications of not having a light source visible from below. He turned it off because the lamp on the bluff face would have left him illuminated and left everything above him in darkness, and putting himself in that position struck him immediately as wrong. He went up in the dark, his hands on the sandstone, which was cold and slightly damp with the perpetual seep of moisture through the rock, rough and real, grounding him in the physical task, his feet finding the ledge placements from memory, each one a decision point, each one requiring a second of careful assessment before committing weight. He did not fall. He moved carefully and he did not fall, and he reached the top and he crawled back from the rim on his hands and knees through the leaf litter, not trusting himself to stand at the edge, putting distance between himself and the drop before he got to his feet. He got behind a white oak and turned his back to the tree and faced north along the ridgeline. The cold came through his hunting clothes immediately. The adrenal chemistry that had kept him warm in the hollow was metabolizing out, and the upper 20s November air was doing what it does to a person standing still in multiple layers, who has sweated through those layers on a fast climb out of a sandstone hollow. He was aware of the cold as a fact rather than a discomfort. It did not have his full attention. His full attention was on the sounds from the north. He heard them before he saw them. Leaf litter sound from multiple sources, heavy and purposeful, coming along the ridgeline from his right. He tried to count the sources, and the number he kept arriving at was 3, though he acknowledged then and later that one of the sources was moving with a quietness that made it harder to locate, and the final count of 3 might have been an undercount by 1. The sound converged toward the rim of the bluff above the overhang, where the hollow floor was deepest. It stopped at the rim. He watched the silhouettes assemble against the last light of the western sky. 3 shapes, upright. The western ridgeline behind the Bankhead country still held the faintest remnant of the November sunset, a thin, pale band of apricot and gray above the tree line, and against it the silhouettes were clear in their basic geometry, if not in their detail. Broad through the chest and shoulders, the skull profile showing the elongated muzzle, the upright pointed ears set high. The largest of the 3 stood at the bluff edge and produced a call. The same quality of sound as what he had heard in the hollow below. The same instrument, structured in low and carrying in the cold air of the canyon, with a clarity that should have required an amplifier and did not. The response came from below. Shorter, quieter. There was a quality of it he associates now with diminishment, with a sound produced by one that has less capacity than it normally would. The wounded one calling back from below the rim, across 40 feet of November air. The 3 shapes moved south along the ridgeline, their footsteps heavy in the dry leaves, and reached the section of bluff where the height decreased enough to allow descent. They went over. He could hear them going down, rock impacts, the movement of heavy bodies on steep stone, and then the heavier impacts when they reached the boulder field at the hollow floor. More vocalizations then, back and forth in the narrow slot of the hollow below him, the pattern of it different from the single voice pattern he had listened to from the hollow floor. Multiple registers, the lower, broader calls of the ones who had arrived from above, and the quieter, more compressed responses from the one who had been waiting. The exchange went on for several minutes, and then shifted in quality, the back-and-forth structure giving way to exchanges running longer from one source and less frequently from another, and then a period of almost complete quiet broken by short, low sounds at intervals he could not predict. He sat against the white oak in the cold, and listened, and let the encounter settle around him in the dark. The cold, by 20 minutes in, was working through the layers in earnest. His feet were the first thing to go, the thermal insulation of his hunting boots insufficient for standing still in upper 20s air after a physical exertion that had burned through much of his body heat. He flexed his toes inside the boots at intervals, and shifted his weight from foot to foot and told himself he was going to stay another 10 minutes after the last vocalization he heard from the hollow. He stayed 30. When he finally stood and moved north along the ridgeline, the quiet of the woods was the original quiet of a forest at rest, not the strained absence of the hollow below the bluff. The thermals had settled in the cold evening air. A barred owl called once from the hollow to the south, the first bird sound he had heard in hours, and the call had the quality of the woods returning to themselves. He went north along the ridgeline until the back slope opened into gentler timber, and he angled down through the hardwoods toward the creek and picked up the Forest Service trail and followed it out. At the truck on Forest Service Road 60, he did what he did because it was the only thing available to do. He got in. He put his rifle on the back seat. He sat with his hands on his thighs in the dark cab and let the encounter come to rest inside him, The way a stone thrown into still water eventually stills the water again. The windshield fogged slowly from the inside. He did not start the engine for a long time. The winter of 2018 into 2019 was the period during which Arlene's engagement with the material took a turn Lonnie had not anticipated and has come to regard as one of the more significant elements of the entire experience. He had expected her to believe him, which she did immediately and without qualification. He had expected her to be unsettled by the material, which she was, in a way she managed with the practicality she applies to all unsettling things. What he had not expected was that she would treat the encounter as a research problem. She did not have an academic background in biology or zoology. She had a practical intelligence that she had applied for 30 years to the management of a household, a family, and a part-time bookkeeping operation she ran from their home. The same intelligence she applied to budget management and tax preparation and the logistical problems of raising 3 children in a rural county with one underfunded school system, she brought to the question of what Lonnie had found in the hollow. Methodically, without preconceptions and without panic, she started with species discovery literature. She read about the discovery of the okapi in 1899, a large forest ungulate in the Congo that European science had no knowledge of, while the indigenous Mbuti pygmy people who lived alongside it knew it thoroughly. She read about the coelacanth, a fish genus believed extinct for 65 million years and rediscovered alive off the South African coast in 1938. She read about the giant squid, the saola of Vietnam, the indri of Madagascar, species that the Western scientific enterprise either missed entirely for centuries or classified incorrectly and later revised. She was building a framework. She was establishing that the failure to recognize a species is a normal scientific failure with a long and well-documented history, not a theoretical possibility being used to explain away discomfort. She moved from species discovery to interspecies communication, not the popular science versions of it. She went looking for the primary literature and read what she could access from the University Library Interlibrary Loan System, which served the Winston County area through the public library in Double Springs. She read about dolphin communication research. She read about the studies on corvid cognition, the intelligence of crows and ravens, the documented capacity of these birds for facial recognition and long-term memory and social information transmission. She read about the experiments with great apes and symbolic communication, the behavioral research on elephant cognition and social structure, the studies documenting the sophistication of wolf pack communication across distance. She was not building a case for anything specific. She was building a vocabulary for thinking about what Lonnie had described: the directed gaze, the structured vocalization, the apparent understanding of what the communication needed to accomplish, and the method by which it needed to accomplish it. She wanted a framework that was scientifically grounded, not one that rested on the supernatural or the folklore or the online discussion communities that Lonnie had found early in his reading and quickly recognized as environments where the signal-to-noise ratio was too low to be useful. By spring, she had the vocabulary, and she brought it to a specific question. She sat across from Lonnie at the kitchen table one evening in March and asked him directly. She said she had been thinking about the directed gaze for 4 months, and she had read everything she could find on the subject, and she wanted to know, from his direct experience in the hollow, whether the communication felt intentional or instinctive. He said he could not answer that with certainty. She said she knew that. She asked what his read was. From 30 years of watching animals in the woods, he sat with the question for a long time. He said his read was that it was intentional. He said that he had watched deer and bear and coyote and turkey for 30 years, and he knew what intentional behavior looked like in a living thing, and he knew what instinctive behavior looked like, and the directed gaze between the rim and himself had the structure of intentional behavior. It was too specific and too repeated and too responsive to his own response to be behavior it was executing without awareness of what it was doing. That was his read. He said he might be wrong. She said she understood that, and that his read was the thing she was asking about, not the certainty. She said she had come to the same conclusion, not from the research she had done, which was inconclusive on the specific question of intentionality in observed cross-species communication events. She had come to it from the structure of the encounter as Lonnie had described it to her in detail over the months following November. It was injured. It was in pain. It was in a confined space with limited options and a group of its own kind approaching from above. The rational calculation available to it, if we apply the framework of rational calculation to a territorial predator managing a complicated situation, was to keep the humans still until the group arrived, and then let the group determine the outcome. The warning that allowed it was, she said, the only element of the encounter she could not explain through territorial intelligence alone. The Forest Service investigation had closed by January of 2019. The incident report was filed with the bare attribution. The illegal snare was catalogued, and the violation was referred to the appropriate enforcement division for follow-up, which in practice meant a file was generated, and a notice was sent to the district law enforcement coordinator, and the case sat in a queue that contained more cases than the staff available to work them. Nobody came back to the hollow. Nobody pulled the file and asked whether a black bear was consistent with a cable snare that had required enough force to pull a 3/8-inch steel cable apart at the anchor. Nobody looked at the math. The math, which Lonnie worked out in the winter after reading enough about both black bears and cable snare mechanics to understand what the numbers meant, was not comfortable. A 3/8-inch galvanized steel cable, the type used in large hog snare operations, has a rated breaking strength of approximately 4,200 pounds. A cable that is frayed and pulled apart at the anchor under tension, rather than cut clean, has been subjected to force applied at an angle that created stress fractures in the cable material over time, a different failure mode from a clean tensile break, and one that typically requires prolonged application of significant force rather than a single sudden pull. A large male black bear in excellent condition weighing 450 pounds, the top end of the Alabama black bear weight range, applying its maximum body weight against a cable in a prolonged pulling effort while panicked, can generate force in the range of 700 to 900 pounds. The cable that snapped on the bluff face in the Sipsey wilderness did not snap under 700 to 900 pounds. It snapped under a force that the cable manufacturer's specifications, rated to over 4,000 pounds, should have been adequate to withstand. It snapped under a force heavier than 450 pounds, and whatever was in the snare was able to apply that force with enough consistency and duration to fatigue the cable at the anchor, which is a different thing from generating a single moment of peak force. It implies a body that could continue effort against an unyielding constraint for long enough to mechanically weaken the connection between the cable and its anchor. Lonnie did not put this calculation in the Forest Service report. He kept it to himself. Dewey's revelation at the Double Springs Diner had a specific texture that Lonnie has returned to many times, not because of what Dewey said, but because of the 6 years that preceded it. 6 years of hunting the same ground with the same partner. 6 years of rut week mornings in the Sipsey drainage, of driving the Forest Service roads in the dark before 5, of eating sandwiches on the tailgate before going in, of comparing notes on deer movement and stand locations and the specific characteristics of the rut week in their section of the Bankhead. 6 years of the ongoing casual intimacy of a long hunting partnership, which involves a degree of regular daily contact during the season that equals or exceeds the contact of many formal friendships. And for 6 years, through all of it, nothing. He knew why. He had known before Dewey said the sentence, because the cost of disclosure was the same for Dewey as it was for everyone else, compounded by the specific additional cost of disclosure to a person you spend rut week with every year in the same woods where the encounter occurred. That cost included Dewey's assessment of his own judgment, which was high, and the potential adjustment to the way Lonnie saw him, which mattered to Dewey in ways that did not require explicit acknowledgement between them because it had been established over 30 years. Silence was the calculation. Lonnie had done the same calculation for the 15 hours between the encounter and the phone call to Dewey, and the only reason the calculation came out differently for him was that carrying it alone for those 15 hours had made clear that alone was not a viable long-term arrangement. What Dewey had seen on the ridgeline above the Thompson Creek drainage in archery season 6 years earlier was consistent with everything Lonnie had found in the hollow. Upright, moving on two legs with a stride inconsistent with any bipedal walker that either of them had seen in the Bankhead, too fast and too long and too quiet for a person in hunting clothes. The shape moving through the young hardwoods with the direction and the pace of one that knew exactly where it was going and had been going there for a long time. Dewey had watched it for 20 minutes through his rangefinder, which gave him a magnification that confirmed it was not a person and a distance measurement that confirmed it was not small. When it crossed the ridge and dropped into the hollow, he held the stand for another 45 minutes and then climbed down and went home. He told his wife he had seen a bear. She asked if he was sure it was a bear. He said yes. The alignment between the two accounts, separated by 6 years of independent silence, across a drainage they had both hunted for decades without discussing the specific quality of what the drainage contained, was the thing that settled it for Lonnie more than any external research. Not because he had needed settling by that point. He had stood 8 feet from the Dogman in the hollow and watched it direct his attention with a structured vocalization and a repeated directed gaze sequence. He did not need Dewey's account to know what he had seen, but Dewey's account placed the being, or one like it, on the ridgeline above the Thompson Creek drainage during archery season 6 years prior, in a different location within the same territory, moving with direction and purpose, not disturbed or displaced but engaged in some ordinary activity of its daily existence. It was not a transient, it was resident. Whatever the territorial range of the upper Sipsey Fork drainage population included, it included the ridgeline that Dewey had been sitting above for 2 hours on an October morning 6 years before November of 2018, and it had been using that ridgeline without disruption for long enough that the movement through the young hardwoods had the character of a regular route rather than an unusual foray. The ecological implications of a resident population in the Sipsey Fork drainage, which Lonnie thought through carefully over the winter, with the kind of methodical consideration he brought to any practical problem that had to be understood fully before it could be managed, were significant in ways that went beyond the immediate question of what was in the hollow. A resident group large enough to produce 4 individuals in the same drainage, 3 at the rim and 1 at the bluff base, implied a breeding population with a viable social structure. Viable social structure in a territorial predator implies a home range large enough to support the group's nutritional requirements, which in the case of an apex predator of the size he had observed in the hollow would have been substantial. It implied access to water, which the Sipsey Fork drainage provided across its full length. It implied shelter, which the rockhouse overhangs of the Pottsville sandstone bluffs provided across miles of the gorge system. It implied a prey base adequate to sustain the group, which in the Bankhead's recovering ecosystem included white-tailed deer in good numbers, feral hogs in variable numbers across the drainage, and the black bear population whose recovery program was producing growing numbers in exactly the kind of deep hollow habitat that the group in the Sipsey Fork drainage appeared to be using as core territory. He also thought about the wild and scenic designation in a way he had not thought about it before the encounter. The Sipsey Fork's wild and scenic designation was exactly the kind of protection that the group in the drainage required, whether or not the protection had been designed with them in mind. The designation prevented the kind of channelization and impoundment and industrial water use that would degrade the creek habitat. The wilderness designation prevented motorized access to the interior. The combination of the two frameworks created, without intending to, a protected zone around what appeared to be core habitat for a species that had no formal protection because it had no formal recognition. The management plan's blind spot was, in this case, accidentally producing the right outcome. The beings in the Sipsey Fork drainage were benefiting from a protected area that had been designated specifically to protect resources that the plan's authors did not know were there. He found this darkly ironic in a way he could not fully articulate. The protections that happened to be covering them were the product of lobbying and environmental advocacy, and federal legislation aimed at protecting the river and the wilderness character of the gorge system for the benefit of the humans, who valued those things, not for the benefit of the things that actually lived in the deepest parts of the gorge and had been using the rockhouse overhangs as shelter for longer than the concept of a national forest had existed. The protection was accidental. Its continuation was contingent on the continued relevance of the human interests that had produced it, and none of the people who maintained and renewed and defended those protections had any knowledge of the most significant reason the protections mattered. Lonnie's retirement, which came about 2 years after the August 2021 county road encounter, was formally the product of the contractor's decision to wind down operations and the terms of the separation agreement that resulted. Those terms were reasonable, and the timing was not entirely unwelcome, and he accepted them without prolonged negotiation. He does not claim definitively that the encounter history in the Sipsey Fork drainage was the reason. He says it is possible that it was not the reason, that the practical terms of the retirement were sufficient explanation and the timing was coincidental. He says it is also possible that 2 years of driving county roads along the Bankhead boundary, knowing what he knew about what was in the drainage behind the tree line, had changed the texture of the work in ways that were not decisive individually, but that accumulated over time into a weight that made the option of stepping away easier to take than it would otherwise have been. He says this without self-pity and without drama. He notes it as a data point and leaves its interpretation open. What he is not open about is the question of the sun. He is clear about this. He considers it regularly, and he has not found a resolution to the ethical arithmetic that satisfies him, and he does not expect to. The argument for telling his son is the simple one. An adult person who hunts terrain that contains an undocumented apex predator has a right to information that would alter his behavior in that terrain, and a parent who has that information and withholds it is making an ethical decision that is difficult to defend, regardless of the motive. Lonnie does not dispute this. He understands the argument in full. What he disputes is the conclusion the argument points toward. He knows his son. He knows the specific texture of his son's response to a challenge, which has been consistent since his son was 12 years old and has not moderated substantially in the years since. His son is not the kind of person who receives information about an undocumented apex predator in territory he hunts regularly and adjusts his behavior by avoiding that territory. His son is the kind of person who receives that information and begins planning a way to get more information. He has the physical confidence of a man in his early 30s who has hunted serious terrain without incident since his teens, and who has not yet had the experience of discovering that confidence and preparation and good judgment are necessary but not sufficient conditions for being safe in all circumstances. He has the specific curiosity of someone whose father has told him news impossible and true, the kind of curiosity that compounds rather than moderates when the source of the information is someone whose word he trusts completely. The scenario that Lonnie cannot contemplate without a specific kind of dread is the one where his son goes into the tightest hollow in the Thompson Creek drainage with a Reconnects trail camera and a plan for locating evidence of the group, not understanding that the group's tolerance for human presence in their core territory has specific limits that his son does not know the location of. Limits that in November of 2018 had come very close to being exceeded by a man with 30 years of experience in that specific drainage, who still barely understood in time what was happening. He carries this. He has accepted that he will carry it without resolution. He has made the practical decision that the harm of telling is greater than the harm of not telling, given what he knows about his son's probable response, and he lives with the discomfort of that decision, with the same pragmatic acceptance he applies to other irreducible discomforts. It is not comfortable. It was never going to be comfortable. The encounter produced a permanent addition to his understanding of the world that could not be given back, and with it, a permanent set of ethical complications that could not be resolved cleanly. He accepts this as the condition of the knowledge.